a quaint cafe in a small coastal town, where the aroma of fresh coffee mingles with the salty sea breeze. Sarah Parker, a vibrant 68-year-old widow, sits alone at her usual corner table, her silver hair neatly styled and her bright blue eyes focused on her crossword puzzle. She had long since accepted that love might not find her again after losing her husband of 40 years. But fate had other plans. That spring morning, a young aspiring musician named Thomas, just 25 years old, walked in with his guitar case, looking for a quiet spot to work on his songs. His genuine smile and old soul caught Sarah's attention immediately. What started as a simple conversation about classical music evolved into daily meetings, where they discovered their shared passion for art, travel, and vintage vinyl records. Their unconventional friendship raised eyebrows in their conservative town. The local gossips whispered behind their hands, but Sarah and Thomas found in each other what they'd been missing: a true connection that transcended age. Thomas saw beyond Sarah's years to her adventurous spirit, while Sarah was drawn to his mature outlook on life and kind heart. When Thomas proposed 6 months later, Sarah's adult children were shocked. Her daughter Lisa, only a few years younger than Thomas, couldn't understand how her mother could consider such an unusual union. But Sarah had learned long ago that life was too short to live by others' expectations. The small wedding ceremony at the beach was intimate, with only a handful of accepting friends present. As Sarah and Thomas exchanged vows, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, as if nature itself was celebrating their unique love story. For their honeymoon, they chose a remote mountain resort, famous for its healing hot springs and spectacular views. It seemed perfect, secluded, romantic, and peaceful. But on their very first night, something happened that would change everything. Something that would make them question not just their marriage, but everything they thought they knew about each other. As they settled into their cozy cabin, surrounded by the whispers of pine trees and the distant call of night birds, Thomas received a mysterious phone call. His face turned pale as he listened to the voice on the other end. Sarah watched in confusion as her new husband grabbed his coat and rushed out into the darkness, leaving behind only a hastily scribbled note. "I'm not who you think I am." Sarah stood there, clutching the note, her mind racing with questions. Was their entire relationship built on lies? What secrets had Thomas been hiding behind his gentle smile and soulful eyes? As the night grew darker and colder, she realized this was just the beginning of a truth more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The sound of footsteps on the wooden porch made her freeze. They were heavy, deliberate, and definitely not Thomas's. As the doorknob slowly began to turn, Sarah realized their honeymoon was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. The story you're about to witness will challenge everything you believe about love, trust, and the masks we wear. It's a tale that proves age is just a number, but secrets can be deadly. Stay tuned to uncover the truth behind this most unusual marriage, and the shocking revelations that would leave a small coastal town forever changed. Sarah's heart pounded as she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy brass candlestick from the mantel. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the pine trees. The door creaked open slowly, revealing not an intruder, but an elderly man in a well-worn suit, his silver hair neatly combed despite the late hour. "Mrs. Parker?" he asked, his voice gentle but urgent. "I'm Richard Bennett, Thomas's former employer. We need to talk." He held up a weathered private investigator's badge, his hands trembling slightly as he did so. Sarah lowered the candlestick but kept her guard up. The past hour had already taught her that nothing was as it seemed. She gestured for Richard to sit in one of the cabin's rustic armchairs, keeping her distance as she perched on the edge of the couch. "Thomas isn't who he claims to be," Richard began, pulling out a thick manila envelope. "His real name is Timothy Brooks, and he's been involved in a series of unusual marriages across 3 states. He spread out photographs on the coffee table, each showing Thomas, or Timothy, with different older women at different wedding ceremonies." Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The beautiful memories of their courtship now felt tainted, like a painting splashed with dark paint. But something didn't add up. She remembered the genuine way Thomas teared up when sharing stories about his childhood, how he knew every detail about the classical music pieces they discussed, how his callous fingers proved his dedication to guitar playing. "There's more," Richard continued, his expression softening with sympathy. "We believe he's connected to the disappearance of rare art pieces from his previous marriages. Private collections, family heirlooms, things that wouldn't be immediately noticed as missing." Sarah's mind raced to her own collection, the valuable paintings inherited from her grandmother, the antique jewelry box filled with centuries-old pieces. But then she remembered something else, something that made her blood run cold. "The phone call he received earlier," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard part of it. Someone said she's found us." Then Thomas or Timothy said something about the real painting and tonight's the deadline. Richard leaned forward, suddenly alert. Did he mention where he was going? Before Sarah could answer, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Thomas. "Meet me at the old lighthouse. Everything I told you about us was real. The rest is complicated. Come alone." Richard reached for his phone, presumably to call for backup, but Sarah raised her hand to stop him. "Wait," she said, years of teaching high school English having honed her ability to read between the lines. "Something's not right about this whole situation." "The Thomas the first no." She trailed off as her phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo, one that made both her and Richard gasp. It showed a painting, one that had been stolen from the Metropolitan Museum of Art 15 years ago. Below it was a message: "I didn't steal this. I've been trying to bring it back. But they won't let me." The wind outside picked up, rattling the cabin's windows. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains. Sarah stood up, grabbing her coat from the hook by the door. Richard started to protest, but she cut him off. "You say Thomas, or whoever he is, has been conning women and stealing art. But what if he's been trying to find something? Or someone?" She pulled out her own photos, memories of the past 6 months. "Look at his eyes in these pictures. Really look. Does this seem like a man running a con, or someone running from something?" As if in response to her words, the lights in the cabin flickered once, twice, and then plunged them into darkness. When they came back on seconds later, Richard was staring at one of the photos with a strange expression on his face. "I think," he said slowly, "we've been looking at this all wrong. The lighthouse you mentioned. It's not just a meeting place. It's where everything started 15 years ago. And if we don't get there in the next hour..." The drive to the lighthouse was treacherous, with rain pelting the windshield and thunder cracking overhead. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing faster than the wipers could clear the rain. Richard sat beside her, frantically making calls on his phone, but the storm was interfering with the reception. "The lighthouse keeper disappeared the same night as the painting," Richard explained between failed calls. "His daughter spent years trying to prove he wasn't involved in the theft. She claimed there was another group, art dealers, who'd do anything to keep their secrets hidden." He paused, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning. "That daughter. She became a private investigator. She's been tracking this case ever since." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as realization dawned. "The woman on the phone, the one who said she's found us. She wasn't talking about me, was she?" The lighthouse appeared through the rain, its beacon cutting through the storm in steady, rhythmic sweeps. As they approached, Sarah noticed another car parked at the base, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. The sight made Richard tense up beside her. "I know that car," he whispered. "It belongs to Eleanor Wright, one of the most prestigious art dealers on the East Coast." "But what's she doing here?" They parked behind a cluster of trees, the rain drumming on the car roof. Through the water-streaked windows, they could see 3 figures arguing near the lighthouse entrance. One was Thomas, his familiar silhouette unmistakable even in the darkness. The second was a woman in an expensive-looking coat, presumably Eleanor Wright. The third figure was partially hidden in the shadows. "Stay here," Richard instructed, reaching inside his jacket. But Sarah was already opening her car door. This was about more than stolen art or false identities now. She needed answers, and she needed them from Thomas himself. As they approached, the wind carried fragments of conversation. "You can't keep hiding it forever," Thomas was saying, his voice strained. "People deserve to know the truth." "Truth?" Eleanor laughed, the sound sharp and cold as the rain. "The truth is worth millions to the right buyer. Your father should have understood that." Sarah's foot hit a loose stone, sending it skittering across the wet ground. All three figures turned toward the sound. Thomas's eyes widened when he saw her, a mix of relief and fear crossing his face. "Sarah, you shouldn't be here," but Eleanor was faster. She reached into her coat and pulled out something that glinted in the lighthouse beam. "How fitting," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "A family reunion, after all these years." The third figure stepped into the light, and Sarah heard Richard gasp beside her. It was a woman in her early 40s, with a badge identical to Richard's clipped to her belt. Her eyes were fixed on Thomas with an expression that mirrored his own. "Hello, little brother," she said softly. "It's been 15 years. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene like a photograph, Thomas reaching toward his sister, Eleanor's hand tightening on what was now clearly visible as a small revolver, and Richard slowly moving to position himself between Sarah and the growing danger. Above them, the lighthouse beam swept across the turbulent ocean, where something dark and massive was approaching the shore, something that would change everything in the next few moments. The wind carried the sound of police sirens in the distance, but they all knew the authorities would never arrive in time. Whatever was about to happen would be settled here, in the next few minutes, between these 6 people and the secrets they'd been carrying for 15 years. Thunder rolled again, and Sarah saw Thomas's hand move toward his jacket pocket, where something flat and rectangular was barely visible, something that looked exactly like the size of the missing masterpiece that had started this all. Thunder crashed as Thomas withdrew not a painting, but an old leather journal from his pocket. Eleanor's eyes widened with recognition, her grip on the revolver tightening. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her composed facade cracking for the first time. "From Dad's old desk at the lighthouse," Thomas answered, his voice steady despite the rain soaking through his clothes. "The real painting was never stolen, was it, Eleanor?" "This journal proves what actually happened that night." The third figure, Thomas's sister Catherine, stepped forward, her investigator's badge catching the lighthouse beam. "The painting in the Metropolitan Museum right now is a forgery," she said. "A very good one, but a forgery nonetheless. Dad discovered your scheme, didn't he, Eleanor? How you'd been replacing priceless artworks with replicas for years, selling the originals to private collectors." Sarah watched as understanding dawned on Richard's face. "That's why there was never any evidence of theft," he breathed. "Because officially, nothing was missing." But Eleanor's laugh cut through the howling wind, taking them all by surprise. "You think you've figured it all out, don't you?" She reached into her coat with her free hand and pulled out a folded document. "Your father signed over everything to me that night, the lighthouse, the real painting, even his silence. Check the last page of that journal, Thomas. See your father's signature for yourself." Thomas flipped to the last page, his hands trembling. But instead of defeat, a smile spread across his face. "You mean this signature?" He held up the page, illuminated by a flash of lightning. "The one dated October 15th? That's interesting, considering the ink testing Catherine had done on it last month proved it was written less than a year ago." The massive shape Sarah had noticed earlier in the ocean was now clearly visible, a Coast Guard vessel, its lights cutting through the storm. But it wasn't approaching randomly, it was following a precise pattern, searching for something. "It's over, Eleanor," Catherine said, moving closer to her brother. "We found the hidden vault." the one behind the lighthouse's old generator. The original paintings, the documentation of every swap you've made over the past 20 years, it's all there. The Coast Guard is retrieving everything as we speak. But Eleanor's smile didn't fade. Instead, she pulled out her phone with her free hand and pressed a single button. Suddenly, the lighthouse beam, which had been sweeping steadily across the water, went dark. In the distance, they heard the Coast Guard vessel's warning horn blast through the night. "You really think I'd leave evidence just sitting in a vault?" Eleanor's voice was almost gleeful. "Everything in there is worthless. The real paintings, the ones worth millions. They're somewhere you'll never find them. And now, thanks to the darkness, your friends in the Coast Guard are about to have a very difficult time navigating these rocky waters." Sarah felt her heart race as she realized what was about to happen. Without the lighthouse beam, any ship too close to shore would be in danger. She looked at Thomas, seeing the same horror in his eyes. But there was something else there too, a glimmer of realization. "The music box," he whispered, turning to Sarah. "The one in your collection, the one you said was too heavy to move. That's why you were so interested in my visits to Sarah's house, wasn't it, Eleanor? It's not just a music box, is it?" Eleanor's composed expression finally cracked completely, her eyes widening with genuine fear for the first time. But before she could respond, a deafening crash echoed from the direction of the Coast Guard vessel, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against rock. In the chaos that followed the Coast Guard vessel's collision, Eleanor made her move. She darted toward her car, but her designer heels slipped on the wet rocks. The revolver clattered away, spinning across the slick ground. Thomas lunged for it, but Catherine was faster, kicking it over the cliff's edge into the churning waters below. "The music box," Sarah suddenly called out, her voice cutting through the storm. "It's not at my house anymore. I moved it this morning to our honeymoon cabin." She met Thomas's eyes, and a silent understanding passed between them. "I noticed something odd about its weight distribution while packing." The base seemed uneven. Eleanor's face contorted with fury. "You're lying," she snarled, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. A powerful spotlight suddenly illuminated the scene, not from the Coast Guard vessel, but from above. The rhythmic thrum of helicopter blades cut through the storm as a police chopper appeared, hovering over the lighthouse. In its light, they could see the Coast Guard vessel had managed to avoid major damage, skillfully maneuvering away from the rocks at the last moment. "That emergency call wasn't about the lighthouse beam," Richard revealed, a hint of triumph in his voice. "It was the signal to move in. We've had Eleanor under surveillance for weeks, waiting for her to lead us to the paintings." But Thomas raised his hand, silencing them. "There's something else," he said, turning to his sister. "Something Dad wrote in his journal that didn't make sense until now." He flipped through the wet pages until he found what he was looking for. The day before he disappeared, he wrote, "The true masterpiece was never the canvas." Catherine's eyes widened. "The lighthouse plans," she whispered. "The ones Eleanor made Dad sign over, they weren't just for the building, were they?" Eleanor laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the lighthouse walls. "You still don't understand. Your father was more clever than any of us knew. The paintings were never in Sarah's music box. They're not even in the vault." She gestured to the lighthouse. "They're in the walls. Built into the very structure itself. Your father redesigned this entire lighthouse 15 years ago, creating hidden spaces between the walls. The plans I made him sign over weren't just for property rights, they were the key to the most elaborate art vault ever created." But Thomas was smiling again. "We know," he said quietly. "Dad left me one last message carved into the bottom of my old guitar. The one I was playing the day I met Sarah. It wasn't coincidence that brought me to that CAF. I tracked the registration of your car to that town, Eleanor. Meeting Sarah. That was unexpected. Real. The only genuine thing in this whole scheme. As if on cue, the lighthouse beam suddenly blazed to life, but something was different. As it rotated, the light seemed to flicker in an unusual pattern. Catherine gasped, grabbing Thomas's arm. "It's Morse code," she said excitedly. Dad modified the beacon. Every night for 15 years, it's been broadcasting the locations of every painting, hidden in a pattern of light that only looks random. That's why you really wanted the lighthouse, isn't it, Eleanor? Not to hide the paintings, but to stop the message from being sent. Police sirens grew louder as multiple vehicles approached. Eleanor's shoulders slumped in defeat, but there was a strange smile on her face. "You've got me," she said, raising her hands. "But there's one painting you'll never find. The most valuable one of all." Her eyes locked with Sarah's. "Check your wedding ring, dear. That stone isn't a diamond." Sarah slipped off her ring, holding it up to the lighthouse beam. Inside the stone, visible only when the light hit it at the perfect angle, was a microscopic image, the missing cornerstone of the entire collection, photographed and preserved in a way no one would ever think to look for. As the police closed in and the storm began to subside, Sarah turned to Thomas. "You could have told me the truth from the beginning," she said softly. Thomas took her hand, careful of the ring that had suddenly become priceless evidence. "I fell in love with you before I knew if my plan would work," he replied. "And then I realized something my father knew all along: sometimes the most valuable things aren't the ones locked away in vaults." The lighthouse beam continued its rotation, still broadcasting its secret message to anyone who knew how to read it, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. 6 months later, Sarah sat at her usual corner. Table in the CAF where it all began. The morning light streamed through the windows, catching the simple silver band that had replaced her evidence ring. Thomas sat across from her, his guitar case propped against the wall, while Catherine and Richard shared the latest updates on the case. "They've recovered all but 3 of the paintings," Catherine said, sliding over a newspaper featuring Eleanor Wright's conviction on the front page. "The art world is still reeling from the scandal. Dozens of private collectors are being investigated. Some of these masterpieces haven't been seen by the public in decades." Richard nodded, adding, "The museum's authentication team was impressed by the forgeries. They're going to be displayed in a special exhibition, The Art of Deception, alongside the recovered originals. Your father's lighthouse designs are part of the exhibition too. They're calling him an architectural genius." Thomas smiled, his hand finding Sarah's across the table. The past months had been a whirlwind of court appearances, press conferences, and lengthy explanations to Sarah's still bewildered children. But through it all, their connection had only grown stronger. "Dad would have loved that," Thomas said softly. "He always said art wasn't just about the final piece, but the story behind it. I think that's why he designed the lighthouse the way he did, turning it into both a vault and a beacon of truth." Sarah squeezed his hand, remembering the day they'd returned to their honeymoon cabin. The music box was exactly where she'd left it, and though it hadn't contained any paintings, they'd found something else inside: a letter from Thomas's father, written the night he disappeared. "The lighthouse has been restored," Catherine added, her eyes bright with emotion. "The Historical Society wants to preserve it as a landmark. They're even maintaining Dad's modified beacon system, though now it blinks out poetry instead of secret messages." The CAF's door chimed, and Sarah's daughter Lisa walked in, carrying her young son. The initial shock of her mother's unusual marriage had faded, replaced by a grudging acceptance after she'd learned the full story. Now, she even managed a genuine smile as she pulled up a chair. "I still can't believe my mother's wedding ring helped crack one of the biggest art heists in history," she said, shaking her head. "Or that my stepfather is younger than me. But," she looked at Thomas, then at her mother's happy face, "I guess sometimes the most unexpected stories turn out to be the best ones." The baby reached for Thomas's guitar, and he carefully lifted it out of reach, making silly faces that set the child giggling. Sarah watched them, her heart full. At 68, she'd thought her life's biggest adventures were behind her. Instead, she'd found herself in the middle of an art theft investigation, a love story, and a family reunion all rolled into one. "There's one mystery left," Richard said, pulling out his notebook. "Eleanor still won't reveal where those last 3 paintings are. She just smiles and says something about hiding in plain sight." Catherine leaned forward, her investigator's instincts sparked. But Thomas just laughed, drawing everyone's attention. "Maybe that's okay," he said, nodding toward the CAF's walls. "Sometimes art isn't meant to be locked away in museums. Sometimes it's meant to be part of everyday life, making ordinary moments beautiful." Sarah followed his gaze to the local artwork decorating the CAF paintings she'd seen hundreds of times but never really looked at. She caught Thomas's meaningful glance and smiled, understanding dawning. Some secrets, she'd learned, were better left as mysteries. As the morning crowd began to fill the CAF, their table grew livelier with conversation and laughter. The story of the old woman who married a young musician had evolved into something far richer, a tale of family, redemption, and the unexpected ways love could bridge any gap. Outside, the lighthouse stood against the horizon, its beacon now spelling out verses about love and time, about art and truth, about endings that were really just different kinds of beginnings. And in its shadow, a new chapter was already starting to unfold.